The second part of our discussion is about the global economy. So, what is it really when it comes to global economy or world economy? So, it is the economy of all humans of the world, referring to the global economic system. So, kasama dito sa i-discuss about the production, the consumption, economic management, and even exchange of financial values and trade of goods and services. So, ito yung mga learning goals natin for this chapter. We will identify the global actors in economic globalization, define the modern international monetary system, articulate a stance on global economic integration. So, ano ba yung stand niyo about it? And then, enumerate the four monetary regimes, identify the effects of economic globalization. So, let's start on what is it really when we say about economic globalization. So, according to benches of 2014, I defined economic globalization as the increasing integration of economies around the world, particularly through the movement of goods, services, and capital across borders. The term sometimes also refers to the movement of people and knowledge across international borders. And what makes economic globalization distinct from internationalization is that the latter, or the internationalization, is about the extension of economic activities of nation states across borders. So, yun yung sinabi ko kanina, kung paano yung movement ng goods and even services across borders or worldwide. So, I have here, you can watch the next video from YouTube. You could just click the link and find out on what's ano ba talaga yung economic globalization. Okay? And next is the interconnected dimension of economic globalization. So, here are the several interconnected dimensions. So, itong apat na to, tandaan nyo, the first one is the globalization of trade of goods and services. So, paano nakipag-trade ang iba't iba nature, different countries. And then, the globalization of financial and capital markets. The globalization of technology and communication. And lastly, the globalization of production. So, dahil dito nagkakaroon ng connection ang bawat countries because of these different dimensions. Origin of globalization in the distant past, the existence of the same world system in which we live stretches back at least 5,000 years ago. The best known example of archaic globalization is the Silk Road, which connected Asia, Africa, and Europe, adapting Fernand Braudel's innovative concept of long duration, meaning a slow-moving, almost imperceptible framework for historical analysis. World system analysts identify the regions of modernity and globalization with the birth of 16th century long-distance trade. Kaya nga nung sinulat ni Adam Smith yung libro na Magnum Opus, An Inquiry of Nations, noong 1776, he considered na yung two greatest discovery or achievement na meron ang human history is yung discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, tapos yung pag-study or yung discovery ng direct sea route to India by Vasco da Gama. Syempre, kasi mas napapadali yung or nagkakaroon na ng connection between different countries. And the real breakthrough came only in the 19th century The annual average compound growth rate of the world trade saw a dramatic increase of 4.2% between 1820 and 1870. So, sobrang taas na ng percentage yan about increasing in terms of world trade. Ngayon nga, 'di ba, sobrang baba lang. Or, because of crisis, mas bumagsak yung, or nag-decrease yung growth ng world trade. And was still relatively high at 3.4% noong 2001. At noong 1913, tumaas siya lalo ng 16 to 17% of world income thanks to the transport revolution. So, ganun kahalaga yung transport revolution. So, nagkakaroon ng mas maraming connection yung iba't ibang countries at mas napapabilis yung production or even yung trading, 'di ba? And then, steamships and railroads reduced transaction costs and bolstered both internal and international exchange. The relatively short period before World War I is often referred to as the golden age of globalization, characterized by relative peace, free trade, and financial and economic stability. So, ganun ka successful or ganun ka yaman yung mga tao dati in terms of globalization before nung World War. Kasi 'di ba after the war, there are lots of things na nawala, lalo na yung transportation. Maraming mga daan or roads, even bridges, 'di ba, na nasira. The International Monetary System Code of 2005 states that international system is the most central area in international economy. Kasi it's the most important transactions in the international economy, including trade, investment, and finance. All depends on the availability of money and credit. Tama nga naman, walang mangyayaring trade, investment, tsaka finance kung walang availability ng money tsaka credit. Thus, one long-term analyst of global monetary issues has stated that the most critical issue of hegemonic stability theorists should not be what the hegemon does or does not do in the trade, but what it does or fails to do to maintain peace and what it does or fails to do to keep the monetary system stable and credit flowing in a steady fashion. Pag sinabi kasi natin hegemon or hegemon, it's the leadership or dominance especially by one country or social group over others. So pag hindi na maintain yung stability ng monetary system, babagsak talaga yung ekonomiya. At hindi yun dahil sa kung paano or hindi yun sa kung ano or dapat na gawin para sa trade. Okay? Ang mahalaga is nagkakaroon ng stability tsaka peace dun sa globalization or sa system. About 29% of the world's circulating currency is located outside the country issuing it. And during the mid-1990s, at least $300 billion of the top currencies, ito yung mga top during the 1990s or mid-1990s, the US dollar, German Dutch mark, and Japanese yen were circulating outside the country of origin. So liberal transactions have resulted largely from advances in communications, technology, and transportation, and that nation-states are finding it increasingly difficult to regulate economic activities. Realist scholars, by contrast, argue that financial transactions have increased with the permission of the most powerful states and that these states continue to dictate the terms for such transactions. So, sa realidad naman talaga, magkakaroon ng financial increase pag merong transaction or pag merong permission from the most powerful states like America or even yung sa Japanese yen before. When we say international monetary system, it is a system that forms rules and standards for facilitating international trade among the nations in the country. So ito yung sinasabi ko na nagkakaroon ng hegemony or hegemon, which is political or economic or military predominance or having a control of one state over the others. So, nagkakaroon sila ng dominant state or yung nasa taas na to make sure na nagkakaroon ng stability tsaka peace yung monetary system. In addition to the current and capital accounts, the balance of payments included two less important items. The statistical discrepancy item results partly from errors in collecting and computing data, but mainly from a government's failure to include all the goods, services, and capital that cross its borders. So, ito yung nagiging isa sa dahilan ba't nagkakaroon ng problema is yung statistical discrepancy. Even naman dito sa Pilipinas, 'di ba, nangyayari talaga siya, hindi talaga totally 100% na correct yung mga statistics even sa consensus kasi meron at meron pa rin na factors na magiging reason ba't nagkaroon ng discrepancy. So ganun din yun sa capital accounts or the yung international monetary system. And then the final item is the change of official reserves. So, isa din to sa dahilan, each country has central bank that holds foreign exchange and gold reserves. So, when a country has a deficit in its current and capital accounts, this amount must be matched by an equivalent reduction in reserves. So, when a country has a surplus in its current and capital accounts, it accumulates the surplus in its reserves. So the total of a country's current account, capital account, is a statistical discrepancy and change in reserves always equals zero. Hence the term balance of payments. So ito yung sinasabi na dapat may stability or balance dun sa mga payments. So there are still yung imbalance of payment include two less important items. So, ito yung nagiging dahilan or lesser na important to make the monetary system works well. Okay? Yung statistical discrepancy and then yung the final item which is the change official reserves. Kaya ganun talaga kahalaga pag merong central bank each country to make sure na hindi sobrang bagsak or bigla na lang mawawala or nasisira yung economy sa each country. And the four monetary regimes constates that the modern period of international monetary relations commonly refers to the existence of four successive monetary regimes: the classical gold standard from the 1870s to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Then nagkaroon din ng gold exchange standard during the first part of the interwar period and the Bretton Woods system from 1944 to 1973 and non-system of floating and fixed exchange rates from 1973 to the present. So, nagkaroon na tayo ng fixed exchange rates nowadays. So, every day yan nag-change depende din sa level or yung economy ng bawat country. So let's have the first regime, the classical gold standard from 1980 to 1914. So the classical gold standard was a fixed rate regime in which governments announces and adhere to a specific exchange rate from their currencies in relation to gold. By making the national currency values more stable, the gold standard facilitated trade and other transactions between economies. So, i-discuss natin mamaya kung ano ba talaga yung gold standard na tinatawag nila. So, itong gold standard, it's a countries agreed to convert paper money into a fixed amount of gold. So, it is a monetary system wherein country's currency or paper money has a value directly linked to the gold. Kasi yung gold, mas na-preserve siya at mas tumatagal, 'di ba? The gold standard was based on orthodox liberal ideas in some important respects. The primary objective was to promote monetary openness and stability through the maintenance of stable exchange rates. This was a period before the John Maynard Keynes introduced interventionist liberal ideas to combat unemployment, and countries were expected to sacrifice domestic social objectives for the sake of monetary stability. Orthodox liberals sometimes refer to the gold standard in highly idealized terms, and in 1981, President Ronald Reagan um, even created a special commission to determine whether the United States should return to the gold standard. However, critics maintain that the poorest country and the poorest countries often assume the largest burden of adjustment under the gold standard through sacrifices in welfare and employment. So, mahirap talaga pag sobrang hirap na ng isang country, poorest classes, kasi pag part siya ng monetary system, siya talaga yung magiging burden ng adjustment or nagkakaroon ng nawawala yung peace or the stability.
To make it easier for you to remember about the classical gold standard regime during the 1980s to 1914, ang best example dito is in US dollar and British pound were pegged na sa $35, it's equivalent to 14.5 euro per ounce of gold. So, it will remain constant na sa $2.41. Ang equivalent nito sa euro is 1 euro. Although all countries had to undergo adjustments to maintain their exchange rates, the gold standard functioned reasonably well because it was backed by the British hegemony, or yung mga British yung talagang nagro-rule or nag to keep the stability of the monetary system. They were also supported by major powers like Britain, France, and Germany. So Britain assumed a leadership role dun sa pag-stabilize ng gold standard by providing public goods to other countries.
The gold exchange standard regime during the year 1914 to 1944, the World War I completely disrupted international monetary relation, but after the war, Britain attempted to establish a gold exchange standard regime. A gold exchange standard, like a gold standard, is based on fixed exchange rates among currencies. However, a country's international reserves under the 19th century gold standards were officially held in gold, whereas official reserves under a gold exchange standard consist of both gold and reserve currencies, which is the British in the interwar period, although the central banks had in fact held reserve currencies as well as gold in earlier years. So the gold exchange standard institutionalized this practice because gold is in scarce supply and depends on new discoveries. A gold exchange standard permits more flexibility in increasing international reserves. So, yung gold talaga na nakatago dun sa mga bangko is for international reserves kasi nga naman, pag pera, nag-change talaga yung rates. But for the gold, it will always stay the same, 'di ba? Kung ano yung amount ng gold sa ibang bansa, ganun din dun sa even other countries. The same lang yung standard. So, during World War I, di ba kanina, for the year 1914, yung mga British government yung nag-rule. So, even nung 1944, yung Britain pa din ang nag-establish ng gold exchange standard. 'Di ba? Ito yung sinasabi na nami-maintain pa rin yung international monetary relation kahit nagkaroon ng World War I kasi 'di ba naapektuhan yung trading or even yung transportation ng mga products. But the gold standard will remain the same. Although British efforts to maintain a gold exchange standard continued for several years, they eventually failed. So, bakit kaya sila nag-fail? So, thus, monetary relations for much of the interwar period were marked by competitive devaluations, a shift to floating rather than fixed exchange rates, destabilizing speculative capital flows, and increased trade protectionism, which culminated in the Great Depression. So, yung Great Depression na yan talaga, yun yung pagbagsak ng ekonomiya ng bawat countries. So, tama nga naman kasi pag gold, wala siyang capital flows. So, stagnant lang siya. Parang pera lang, 'di ba? Even if naiipon mo siya, hindi talaga siya tutubo kasi stagnant lang. Mas mahalaga talaga na nagkakaroon ng investment para mas tumataas lalo yung balance or money. But for this type of Great Depression, so ano ba yung Great Depression na to? So maybe we've encountered it when we were high school or even nung elementary. The Great Depression was actually the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world that lasting from 1929 to 1939. So nagkaroon ng stock market crash. So bagsak na bagsak talaga yung ekonomiya. So this Great Depression was the worst downturn in the history, and it began the stock market crash noong October 1921 na nag-sent sa Wall Street. Diba yung Wall Street, ito yung maraming investors or maraming businesses that sent ng mga Wall Street into a panic and wipe out millions of investors. Over the next several years, consumers, spending, and investment dropped. Kasi, paano nga mag-spend yung consumer kung walang-wala din sila, di ba? Dahil sa economic crisis. So, causing steep declines in industrial output and employment as failing companies laid off workers. So, pag bumagsak yung ekonomiya, nagtatanggal talaga ng mga trabahador or employment yung may-ari ng companies. And by 1933, when the Great Depression reached its lowest point, some 15 million Americans were unemployed and nearly half the country's banks had failed. So imagine that, 50% yung pumagsak na bangko. So how much more, 'di ba, to the other investors? So, hindi talaga sila mag-i-invest. So ito yung kinakatakutan ng lahat, yung Great Depression. And hopefully, sana hindi siya mangyari nowadays, lalo na pag may pandemic, which is one of the reasons talaga kung bakit bumabagsak kasi nawawala yung investors and even consumers, yung paggasto ng consumer kasi wala din silang pera. So the stock market centered at New York, the stock exchange on Wall Street sa New York City was the scene of reckless speculation. So everyone dun sa New York during this Great Depression, from millionaire tycoons to cooks and janitors, poured their savings into stocks. As a result, the stock market underwent rapid expansion, reaching its peak in 1929. So by then, the production had already declined. And then the employment have rise, mas tumaas yung unemployment and living stock prices much higher than their actual value. So additionally, wages at that time were low. Consumer debt was proliferating. So sobrang laki na ng mga utang. So yun yung sinasabi na Great Depression. So ganun talaga ang pagbagsak. Even yung gold standard ay bumagsak rin. The Bretton Woods system regime, the World War II was marked by a breakdown of monetary cooperation and a period of exchange controls and planning for a post-war monetary regime culminated in the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference. The Bretton Woods monetary regime was a gold exchange standard in which the value of each country's currency was pegged to gold for the US dollar. Unlike the previous two regimes, however, the Bretton Woods system was based on the post-war interventionist liberal compromise. On the other hand, the planners assumed that the peg exchange rates would provide sufficient monetary stability to permit a resumption of normal international trade. On the other hand, the planners ensured that there was some flexibility and assistance so that countries would pursue domestic objectives related to employment and inflation. This marked a contrast with the classical gold standard in which long-term exchange rate stability looked precedence over domestic requirements. The creation of International Monetary Fund, so na-explain naman kanina kung ano yung functions tsaka kagandahan na meron yung International Monetary Fund. That was an international organization embedded in the Bretton Woods monetary. So, nag-provide sila ng mga temporary loan or short-term loan for temporary balance of payments problems. And then, under the IMF Articles of Agreement, members were required to peg their currencies to gold or the US dollar, which is valued at $34 per ounce of gold. And member states were also to contribute to a pool of national currencies that would be available for IMF loans to deficit countries. So each IMF member was given a quota based on its relative economic importance, which determined the size of subscription or contribution to the IMF resource pool. Under the IMF's weighted voting system, the most economically powerful states have the largest quotas and subscriptions and the most votes. So, hindi lang talaga siya base sa pera, even dun sa most votes na binigay dun sa mga kasama na countries. Okay? And then, at regular intervals of not more than 5 years, the IMF decides whether to propose adjustments in the members' quotas in accordance with the changes in their relative economic positions. Kaya maganda na pag tumaas talaga yung ekonomiya, 'di ba, ng isang bansa, mas nagiging tumataas din yung quota niya or yung position niya doon sa IMF fund na group. For the functioning of the Bretton Woods monetary, so we have here 3 functions. The Bretton Woods was gold exchange regime in which the main reserves gold and the US dollar. So ito yung pinakamataas sa kanila, or with the highest position sa US, is yung US. Economists generally ask three questions about the adequacy of reserve assets and upholding a monetary regime. So first one, are there sufficient reserves, gold and the US dollar, for liquidity or financing purposes? So as interdependence increases, more liquidity is necessary to cover the growing number of economic transactions. But if there is a surplus of liquidity, inflation and other problems can result. And then, is there confidence problems with the existing reserve assets? So when countries lack confidence that an asset's value will remain reasonably stable, they are reluctant to hold the assets in their reserves. So confidence problems have led to periodic efforts to sell off British pounds and US dollars. And then another question to know the adequacy of reserves asset is, what adjustment options do reserve currency countries have in dealing with their balance of payments deficit? So an effective regime should provide all deficit countries with a sufficient range of adjustment options. So ito na talaga yung nagtutulong-tulungan yung bawat country to support each other. Di lang nila hayaan na bumagsak. So, yun yung function ng Bretton Woods na to. So, what is it really ang role ng US dollar? Bakit mahalaga sa Bretton Woods monetary regime? So, because the Bretton Woods monetary regime was based on a gold exchange standards also, the central banks could hold their international reserves in two forms. So, may choices sila between gold and foreign exchange. In any proportion they choose, it is ironic, however, na yung original attraction of gold as a reserve assets, its scarcity became a liability as increased trade and foreign investment led to growing demand for international reserves, with gold mining sources limited in Western Europe recovering from World War II. The US dollar was the only currency that could meet this need for increased liquidity. Monetary relations immediately after the war were more unstable than expected, with balance of payments deficits and lack of foreign exchange seriously hindering Europe's recovery. Kaya 'di ba nung una sikat yung sa Europe, but during this Bretton Woods, mas yung US dollar was the only currency that could meet this need for increased liquidity. Maganda sa Bretton Woods system regime, wherein the planners ensured that there was some flexibility and assistance so that the countries could pursue domestic objectives related to employment and inflation. Kaya mas maganda naman talaga pag nagkakaroon ng assistance each country na kasama dun sa monetary system para ma-maintain talaga yung stability. Kasi pag merong poorest of the poor na country, sila talaga yung hihila dun sa mga mas successful. Kaya mas maganda yung nagkakaroon ng balance para maganda din yung flow ng monetary system. Okay? So, here's the landmark of monetary system, wherein the Bretton Woods Agreement was drafted in 1944 and is a vital piece of financial history. It held meetings at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. In the United States, it was ratified by an agreed number of the 44 allied nations and created the today's International Monetary Fund, or yung known siya na IMF. So according to Con of 2005, the Internationalist Liberal had three major elements. So let's find out kung ano tong tatlong to. The first element was the Postwar gold exchange standard, which was in fact an adjustable peg exchange rate rather than a fixed exchange rate system. So wala silang fixed exchange rate. So although yung mga countries, for the countries to maintain yung value of their currencies in the short term, all countries other than the United States should devalue or revalue yung currencies under IMF guidance to correct chronic balance of payment problems. So maganda talaga na nagkaroon na ng IMF or International Monetary Fund kasi nagkakaroon na, nagbibigay na sila ng guidance para makorek yung mga problems or lalo na yung sobrang laking utang. And then the devaluation lowers hope that the cooperative IMF framework for changing currency values would provide flexibility. Tapos, lalo na dun sa walang-wala talaga in terms of classical gold standard. Tapos, ma-avoid din yung competitive devaluation such as those of the interwar period. Kasi, pag sa IMF, nagtutulong-tulungan sila. And they were guiding each other para mas maganda yung flow ng monetary fund. And then the second element of the interventionist liberal compromise was the IMF, which would provide short-term loans. Short-term loans are provided to countries with temporary balance of payments problems and thus alleviate domestic problems resulting from the need to maintain exchange rate stability. So maganda talaga pag may loan, although hiniram din, there's still a percentage for it na para nagkakaroon na para mas lumaki din yung International Monetary Fund. And it's a good sign na nagkaroon ng guidance kasi hindi nila hayaang bumagsak yon. It's win-win situation. Alam mo yung natulungan mo na and yung natulungan mo na country would also help improve the system of the monetary system. And the third one is the element of the compromise was support for national controls over capital flows. So speculative capital flows had contributed to great instability during the interwar period, and the post-war negotiators feared that such speculation could undermine efforts to peg exchange rates and promote freer trade under the Bretton Woods regime. And the chief negotiators also believed that unrestricted capital flows would interfere with the functioning of the welfare state if corporations and citizens could freely move capital abroad to evade taxes. This would jeopardize funding the state required social welfare expenditures. It's good as gold. So under the IMF guidance, other countries at times change the par value of their currencies relative to gold, and the US dollar's value was to remain fixed rate of $35 per ounce of gold. So the fixed rate was designed to ensure that the dollar would be as good as gold. So ganun ka sikat yung US dollar before. It's good as gold. Thus, the United States agreed that the exchange of all dollars held by foreign central banks and treasuries for gold at the official rate. This commitment seemed to be perfectly reasonable because the United States held as much larger share of gold reserves after the war than any other country. Most other countries, in fact, preferred US dollar to gold for their reserves and after the war than any other country. And most other countries, in fact, preferred US dollars to gold for their reserves and international transactions. Dollars, unlike gold, earned interest and did not have to be shipped and stored. So, ayun, kasi yung dollars naman, yung money, you can bring it anywhere. So, nag-iba na yung mindset nila or perception. Before kasi, diba, gusto nila yung gold kasi nakikip tapos maintain lang yung currency nila. But during the IMF guidance, dahil yung US ang unang talagang mas nag-increase yung economy or mas tumaas yung ekonomiya nila, they prefer na lang na US dollar kasi nasi-ship nila and even stored it so easily, unlike dun sa gold na itatago mo pa tapos you could not shift it easily. Pero ang US dollar, nagkakaroon ka pa ng interest of it. Okay? But you know what guys, even if yung United States yung nag-serve as hegemon or siya yung pinaka nagli-lead sa global monetary regime, so several changes in the late 1950s happened. Kung sila pa rin ba ang magko-continue ng leadership sa IMF? Because there's something happened. The United States regularly had a substantial balance of trade surplus in the post-war period, but it had even larger debts. That's because of the economic and military financing. It was providing through the Marshall Plan and other assistance programs. So as a result, yung United States ay nagkaroon ng overall balance of payments deficit in beginning of 1950. So imagine gano'ng kalaki yon. It's $1.5 billion per year for most of the decade. But they increasingly rapidly in the 1950s, an observer began to speak of a dollar problems, nagkaroon din ng shortage. In 1960, yung US payments deficit rose to from 1.5 billion, naging 3.7 billion, and foreign dollars holding exceeded the US gold reserves for the first time. Thus, yung European government, which have eagerly sought to obtain dollars, became reluctant to have excessive dollar reserves. Major change raised questions about U.S. controlling over monetary relation was the growth of the euro currency market. Diba, tumataas talaga yung euro even nowadays. Mas mataas siya sa dollar. Euro currencies are national currencies trade and deposited in banks outside the home country. As the name connotes, euro currency originally developed in Europe. So, yun yung nagkaroon ng questions kung US pa rin ba ang mag-lead or yung euro na. A shift towards multilateralism as U.S. balance of payments deficits continue to increase, the dollar slipped from top currency to negotiated currency status during the 1960s. So a top currency is favored for international monetary transactions because other has confidence in the strong economic position of the issuing state. So sabi ko nga kanina, ang position mo dun sa IMF ay nagbe-base din dun sa votation from the other countries. So a negotiated currency does not benefit from this high degree of confidence, so the issuing state must offer inducement to others to continue accepting its leadership and must be open to more multilateral management. Kasi hindi naman pwedeng porket sila yung unang nag-lead, they will continue leading the group, diba? It will really change. Lalo na pag hindi na niya kayang isupport yung ibang countries. So thus, yung G10 established the General Arrangement to Borrow, or GOB, in 1962, under which they agreed to lend the IMF to $6 billion in their own currencies if needed for supplementary sources to cope with international monetary problems. So itong G10 na to, it actually represented a shift from unilateral U.S. management to more collective management of monetary issues because it had to approve each request for supplementary support. Diba yung sa IMF kanina, kung US lang yung nag-lead, it's unilateral kasi isa lang nag-lead. Pero for this multilateralism, so mas marami yung nagli-lead tapos dapat nagkakaroon ng approval for each request for supplementary support. Kasi mas maganda naman talaga pag multilateralism kasi hindi lang isa ang nagdedesisyon. Dapat lahat. So here's the group of 10 members, or we call them as G10. So refers to the group of countries that agreed to participate in the General Arrangement to Borrow, or GAB, established in 1962, an international agreement to provide the IMF with additional funds to increase its lending ability. So hindi lang mabibigyan ng temporary or short loan yung mga temporary deficit na bansa, but they could provide more because merong tumataas or nagiging maganda yung lending ability nila because of G10, of group of 10. Pero, group of 11 talaga siya. So, I'll provide another discussion about this. Just use the link that I sent to you to understand it more. So we have Belgium in Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands. Yun yung mga country na nag-support or nag-create ng general arrangement to borrow. For floating exchange rates, so we have the supply and the demand. A floating exchange rate is a regime where the currency price is set by the forex market based on supply and demand compared with other currencies. This is in contrast to a fixed exchange rate in which the government entirely or predominantly determines the rate. The currencies of most of the world's major economies were allowed to float freely following the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971. So imagine nyo guys, kahit wala talagang nagsistay on top, even yung Bretton system ay bumagsak din noong 1971. So, dapat kinoconsider nila yung supply tsaka demand. Ganun naman, di ba, nowadays, nagdidepende lang yung supply sa demand. Kung mataas yung demand, need din ng mataas na supply. Pero kung mababa lang naman yung demand, why are you going to produce more, di ba? Dapat mo din babaan kasi para maintain pa rin yung economic globalization. And then yung the move to floating rates had an appeal for both some liberals and then sa realists. So according to them, so mga liberals in particular, they argued that floating rates were preferable because adjustment of international exchange rate would depend on market pressures rather than the government involvement. So more on sa ano lang talaga sila, sa supply tsaka demand nagfo-focus as instead dun sa government involvement. So thus, as early as 1953, Friedman argued that instability during the 1930s had resulted more fundamental economic and financial problems. So ironically, yung floating rates were also appealing to some realists because of the view that governments would be able to adopt independent monetary policies. Kasi nga, kung mas maganda nga pag independent kaysa mag-consider ka pa sa ibang bansa, 'di ba? Kung sino yung nagli-lead, siya lang talaga. But for floating exchange rates, sino yung maganda yung ekonomiya, sila talaga yung mas nangunguna because of their independent monetary policies. Here are the global actors in economic globalization. So, merong tatlong actors na to that we need to familiarize. The first one is, so it's not written here, I'm sorry, but you could check it in the module. The first actor in economic globalization ay ang International Government Organization. I'm sorry, nandito pala siya. So, yung International Government Organization, it refers to an entity created by a treaty involving two or more nations to work in good faith on issues of common interest. So, yung international governmental organization or yung tinatawag nilang IGO strive for peace, security, and deal with economic and social questions. So, example na to sa economic globalization ay ang United Nations, the World Bank, and on a regional level are North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO and Association of Southeast Asian Nations where the Philippines also belong. So dito tayo talaga mostly humihingi ng tulong. They serve as a global actor for economic globalization. Next is the International Non-Governmental Organization. So, or the NGOs, they work toward solutions that can benefit undeveloped countries that face the backlash of economic globalization, classified as a non-profit voluntary citizens group which is organized on a local, national, or international level. So, dito sa NGO, they perform various services and humanitarian function. So, ibig sabihin, more on humanity talaga. They do it through their heart with passion, hindi sa pera yung pagtulong nila. It brings citizens concerned to government advocate and monitor policies, encourage political participation through provision of information. So here are the examples of this. Halimbawa, dito ay yung Red Cross, yung Greenpeace, and Amnesty International. So nowadays, marami pang non-governmental organizations na gumagawa talaga or tumutulong because of humanitarian functions and for services. And multinational corporations or MNCs are corporations which have overseas branches. One of the many changes they have brought to developing countries an increase in automation. So, ang automation, ito yung tinatawag nilang paggamit or using the use of various control system for operating equipment such as machinery with minimal or reduced human intervention. It may damage less automated local firms and require workers to develop new skills in order to transition into changing economy like Ford Motor Corporation, Fujitsu, the General Electric, diba? Ito yung mga sikat na multinational corporations. And we have the effects of economic globalization on developing countries. So, ano ba talagang epekto nito? More of 2017 states that financial and industrial globalization is increasing substantially and is creating new opportunities for both industrialized and developing countries. Yung largest impact has been on developing countries who are now able to attract foreign investors and foreign capitals. This has both positive and negative effects for those countries. So, una dito yung increased standard of living. Of course, pag maganda naman talaga ekonomiya, mas tumataas din yung standard of living. Parang pag mas malaki yung kita mo, mas maganda yung kita mo, mas maganda talaga yung buhay or yung standard of living mo. So, we have economic globalization. It gives governments of developing nations access to foreign lending when these funds are used in infrastructure including roads, healthcare, education, and social services. The standard of living in the country increases. If the money is used only selectively, however, not all citizens will participate in the benefits. Kaya, di ba sa America before, dahil maganda yung status nila, maganda din yung standard of living. From the healthcare sa education, di ba, they could provide free. Kasi nga, maganda yung standard ng bansa nila. Tapos, mas mayaman sila. And to access to new markets, of course, globalization leads to freer trade between countries. So you could trade or import or export different products. This is one of its largest benefits to developing nations. So homegrown industries see trade barriers fall and have access to a much wider international market. So yung growth this generates allows companies to develop new technologies and produce new products and services. So parang ano lang to because of free trade, syempre yung mga technologies produced ng Japan, 'di ba? Pwedeng i-export nila dun sa other countries. That makes the new market. So, mas maganda nga pag yung technology yung ginagamit, lalo na yung mga updated, kasi mas napapabilis yung production and even transportation of services. So, yun yung kagandahan sa economic globalization. So, an example here, yung sa access ng global market, ay yung sa Starbucks, diba? It's founded noong 1971, tapos started becoming profitable in 1980s. So, sobrang tagal na talaga niya. But look at Starbucks now, diba? They have more than 20,000 stores located in almost major countries in the world. We don't know kung gaano kalaking effect din ang pandemic nowadays, diba? However, due to the global coronavirus pandemic, it cost Starbucks an estimated of $915 million in revenue as its stores closed around the globe, and same store sales declined for the first time of more than a decade. So, bumagsak yung ekonomiya, even businesses, 'di ba? Yung mga stores ay nag-close din. The widening disparity in incomes, or ibig sabihin ng disparity is different from each other. So while an influx of foreign companies and foreign capital creates a reduction in overall unemployment and poverty, it can also increase the wage gap between those who are educated and those who are not. Over the longer term, education levels will rise as the financial health of developing countries. But in short term, some of the poor will become poorer. Not everyone will participate in an elevation of living standard. So, dito pumapasok talaga na, 'di ba kaya yung mga Filipinos when they apply to other countries, hindi sila tinatanggap kasi nga yung standard nila ay kailangan yung tulad sa K to 12. Yun yung years of education na meron dapat ang isang worker. So, that's a good ability then na or improvement na meron ang country natin to add the K to 12 kasi mas nagwa-wide yung nagiging reason din siya para mag-increase yung economic globalization dito sa ating bansa kasi mas nagiging effective at saka competitive with the other countries. Kaya nating makipagsabayan sa kanila. Okay? And then decrease employment. The influx of foreign companies into developing countries increases employment in many sectors, especially for skilled workers. However, improvements in technology come with new businesses and that technology spreads to domestic companies. Yung automation in the manufacturing and agricultural sectors lessen the need for unskilled labor, and employment rises in those sectors. If there is no infrastructure to help the unemployed train for the global economy, social services in the country may become strained trying to cater for the new underclass. Kaya dito sa Pilipinas, nagkakaroon ng trabaho talaga yung ibang tao, or they could visit other countries and become competitive doon dahil meron tayong TESDA to make sure that those people will be well trained for skilled labor. That's all for the the third week of our discussion, and hope you could read the module, guys, for more understanding. Thank you.